Donald Trump's second presidency comes amid a great power battle between the U.S. and China across a range of issues, from global trade to diplomatic and military influence around the world, to the fight for dominance over futuristic technologies such as artificial intelligence. Trump has threatened massive tariffs on Chinese goods, and questions are swirling around how he might dramatically reshape U.S. policy toward the Communist Party-ruled country. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at the Washington Times, and for this edition of the Threat Status Influencers series, we're at the headquarters of the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C., and we're lucky to be joined by Anja Manuel, Executive Director of the Aspen Strategy Group and the Aspen Security Forum. She's a critically acclaimed author, a former high-level U.S. State Department official, and a specialist on Asia policy. Anja, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Let's jump right into this. Many credit Trump with shifting U.S. policy during his first term to recognize China as America's top strategic adversary. Joe Biden largely carried forward with that, particularly in the realm of tariffs, but was really cautious in framing China as a great power competitor rather than an adversary or an enemy. Where should things go from here? What's your advice out of the gate for the new Trump administration vis-a-vis China policy?
China is front and center in everybody's mind. Whether you call them a competitor or an adversary, we need to be dealing with them. And so I would hope that the new administration, as it seems like they will be very clear with China about what our red lines are and will be tough where needed. We used to talk a lot about where the U.S. and China can still cooperate versus compete. I think the space for cooperation is unfortunately shrinking. I do think the Biden administration got some good cooperation on fentanyl, and most importantly, to my view, restarting the military-to-military contacts and conversations. They're not as numerous as I would like them to be, but that is critically important. I really hope the Trump administration keeps that. I think they will, because even at the height of the Cold War, as you know, with the Soviet Union, we always had very good contacts, military to military, to make sure that any crisis that might happen doesn't spiral out of control.
The race for dominance over advanced tech, specifically AI microchips and microchips that could be used in advanced weaponry, that seems like it's near the center of U.S.-China tension right now. What's the status of the U.S.-China tech race? Who's ahead right now? Did Joe Biden's policy of a small yard but a high fence with regard to trying to limit China's access to U.S.-designed advanced microchips, did that work? Help me understand where we're at going forward with this.
Absolutely. So historically, the country that leads in technology leads the world. Roman roads, British steamships, Chinese gunpowder, that's always been the case. The United States and our friends and allies for the last several decades have been the uncontested leader technologically around the world. And now China is incredibly innovative and they are rapidly catching up. I do not think we need to be in the lead on every technology on Earth, but I would give you a short list where I believe we, with our friends and allies, need to be world-class and probably outpacing the Chinese. So number one, you mentioned it, semiconductors. It's the building block of everything else that happens in technology. Number two, artificial intelligence. This is a general purpose technology that's a little bit like electricity. It's going to power everything else. 5G and 6G, those are the networks that run all communications. They're going to run the Internet of Things. They're going to run self-driving cars. They're super critical to what we're doing in AI. There, the Chinese have a real lead. It's worrisome. You don't want to be just reliant on Chinese infrastructure. Then on biology, we don't have to lead in everything, but the things that intersect with national security and biotech, it's important for us to set the values for that. And then you can have a smattering of other ones. I work a lot with financial technology companies in the blockchain. We were the undisputed leader in that. I think we've squandered it through ham-handed regulation. And it makes it easier for China to evade U.S. sanctions, for example. So I think those are the areas that are quite critical. The Trump administration deserves real credit for calling out this race and focusing on it. And I think in their first administration, they started out by trying to build a moat around some American technology. The Biden administration continued that with export controls that you mentioned on the most advanced semiconductor chips, on the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, the machines that make the chips. Those were all positive things. I do think the hobbling your opponent piece of this is a strategy that has been important, but that has almost run out of steam. So now we should focus on really running faster ourselves. The great strength of the American, of us, is how much intersection there is between our private sector, between our universities, between government R&C. That ecosystem, I live out in Silicon Valley, that ecosystem is unparalleled in the world. And if you look at a very good bill that the Biden administration got through, the CHIPS and Science Act, it had famously $52 billion in subsidies to bring more semiconductor manufacturing here. The part that got so much less attention was the $173 billion that was supposed to go into advanced government basic science R&D. Now, that doesn't have a lot of lobbyists for it, so the funding for that has gotten steadily lower. It's been cut. One of the best things I believe that the Trump administration could do coming in is reestablish that funding. For every dollar of basic R&D that we do in the United States, you get $5 of societal value. That's GPS, that's Siri, that's all the groundwork for all of the amazing work that's happening now on AI. So that's a really important part of running faster.
There's a lot of concern, particularly among Republicans in the House of Representatives, that there isn't enough government oversight right now on U.S. universities and some private companies that are doing joint research, joint advanced tech research with Chinese partners, sometimes at joint research centers that are based in China. Do you think that this administration should do more to crack down?
You put your finger on a really important and really nuanced problem. One of our great strengths is the openness of our system and the fact that our universities are the best in the world, and so they attract the best talent from around the world. We don't want to stop that. We don't want to out-China China. However, the Chinese and others have also taken advantage of our openness, and they send a lot of really well-meaning students who just want to make a better life here for themselves in America. And they bring some people who are spies or some people who are strong-armed by the Chinese government through threats on their family and others into spying. And it's very hard for universities to figure out who's who. And so what's already starting to happen is that the US government is helping make sure that people who really are spying for the Chinese or Russians or others aren't getting visas to come in as researchers and students. There are existing conflict of interest laws that universities have that just weren't enforced very well. We should be enforcing them better.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about military and intelligence tensions. During the Biden administration, tensions soared after the 2023 alleged spy balloon, Chinese spy balloon incident, that balloon that was shot down off the coast of South Carolina. China, of course, has denied that there was anything askew happening.
It was a weather balloon, right?
It was a weather balloon, according to Beijing. But right now, what we've seen at the start of the Trump administration is a lot of talk about Chinese building of dual-use ports around the world, whether it's in Africa, but specifically in Latin America. There's this idea that China could control the Panama Canal. What can you tell me about how concerned the United States should be at this moment with regard to Chinese military expansion outside of the Indo-Pacific, right here in the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah. Very important question, and I'm glad that the Trump administration is continuing the focus on it, because I think there's really here not that much difference between Biden and Trump. Very concerned. 3 points that you made. One, on intelligence. The Chinese are master spies. They're master hackers. They have penetrated basically everything we have in the cyberspace. We need to do better at protecting ourselves, at protecting our companies, and probably do a little bit more to take the fight to them. AI will help with that because AI is going to be a masterful technology for the collection of intelligence and also for the sifting through analysis function once you have all that data from different sensors. So that's on the intelligence side. On the military side, Sometimes when I read the US press, the Chinese military is described as 10 feet tall. They're good. They're strong. They're growing at 7% a year. They're still spending less as a percentage of GDP on their military than we are. Here's where I would tell you that the PLA is really quite good. Cyber, as we already talked about, intrusion detection, and adversarial sort of offensive cyber, they're excellent. Naval power, they're growing rapidly. A really worrying thing is I saw a couple of weeks ago a news article that they're now building things that look like landing barges for an amphibious attack on Taiwan. That's worrying. They're rapidly increasing their nuclear stable of missiles and their triad. However, they also have problems. As you know, we're on our third defense minister in China, and now this third one is also being investigated for corruption. 12 senior generals have been fired, and some of them disappeared, most of them in the rocket force. So there's something going on there, whether it's real corruption, whether it's lack of perceived complete loyalty to Xi Jinping. So they have problems too. So I would just encourage us to be sober and thoughtful about the PLA rather than making them out to be either larger or smaller than they actually are. And then the third point you mentioned is kind of the penumbra, like what is China doing investing around the world and how are they trying to win hearts and minds? And that I think you have to parse pretty carefully. I think Laura Richardson, who was in Latin America.
Actually, I met with her at the Aspen Security Forum last summer. Yeah, and she spoke out quite a bit about Chinese activity in Latin America, kind of trying to get the attention of the Biden administration to put more focus on it.
The difficult thing about when you look at China's One Belt, One Road initiative is we're not going to compete. We cannot put $1 trillion in infrastructure around the world. And there are certain small parts of One Belt, One Road that just make the roads smoother, the railways run faster. That part is least concerning. The most concerning is exactly what Laura Richardson called out, dual-use port facilities, things that could suddenly become military even though they're billed as civilian. And frankly, the digital Silk Road, the vast surveillance infrastructure that the Chinese have built mostly in friendly authoritarian regimes to themselves that help keep other dictators in power, help them create an Orwellian surveillance system of their people, and help, again, the Chinese spy on everybody else.
You have brought up Taiwan a couple of times. What is your advice for the Trump administration vis-a-vis the Taiwan situation? And specifically, I want to ask you about Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. You also mentioned the CHIPS Act. Part of the CHIPS Act involves subsidizing or giving about a little more than $6 billion to TSMC to directly invest in building fabrication and manufacturing facilities in Arizona. President Trump has expressed some skepticism about this, particularly at a moment when TSMC has a really dominance over this sector globally. It's almost like a monopoly, some will argue. Would it be wise for the Trump administration to reevaluate this relationship, or should it go all in with TSMC as a microchip leader that could be making chips in the United States?
Yeah, it's a very important question. So when we talked about the U.S. China tech race, we talked about staying in the lead, but not just the United States. The United States can't do it alone. We have to do it with our friends and allies. Semiconductors is an unbelievably complicated business. So the United States absolutely leads in design of chips. And we lead with the Dutch and one company in Japan on creating the machines that make the chips. We are not as good at the fabs, which is the actual manufacturing of the chips, because that was considered low margin. Our companies didn't want to do it. So mostly they get designed here. The chips get made in Taiwan, famously by TSMC. They're the best in the world. In Korea, some in Japan. And then they get put in all of the electronics that are in our pockets all over the world. So undoing that ecosystem and bringing all of it back to homegrown American companies here, I think is unfeasible in the short and medium term. So that's a long way of saying We really should be partnering with TSMC. There's no problem with that. It was actually the Trump administration that started the work to put that big fab in Arizona that's now about to get started. And I think that's a positive thing.
We're at a moment where finding common ground, as you said, between Beijing and Washington, that may be becoming more and more difficult. But President Trump has an existing relationship with Xi Jinping. Are you hopeful that there can actually be momentum toward high and mid-level, working level dialogue that staves off what could be a confrontation between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, I think he does have a strong relationship with Xi Jinping, and it will be important. Look, diplomacy does do two things. One, you try to find common ground if that's possible. And two, if you can't find common ground, you make sure there's no misunderstanding. I think with the Chinese right now, common ground is difficult to find. I know Nick Burns, who just left as ambassador to China, said it's been about 20% cooperation and 80% competition. I think that will continue. I do hope that the president talks to Xi Jinping early and often. That doesn't mean we need to agree. I do hope that he instructs his cabinet to have constructive conversation with the Chinese. That doesn't mean we need to kowtow or cave to what they want. Here at Aspen, we run a Track 2 dialogue with senior level Chinese. It's often just about hearing and understanding each other. There are dialogues with the Chinese on artificial intelligence. I think those are particularly important. But the Chinese, despite our best efforts, are really world-class at AI. The latest AI model that came out, DeepSeek, out of China, is virtually as good as our foundation models, or in some areas as good as, or even better. So we have no choice but to make sure that we jointly let AI run and let it be the amazing technology that it will be. Let it help both of our economies and the economy of the world. But there are certain areas where AI intersects with national security that can be extraordinarily dangerous. And we should continue to be talking to the Chinese about that.
Anja Manuel, so interesting, very insightful. Thank you so much for joining me for this edition of the Threat Status Influencers series. And thank you to the Aspen Institute. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So happy to be here with you.
I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.